Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. Our AI narration lets you delve into the wisdom of timeless books, extracting those golden nuggets of insight. We always hear about these big industry titans, these guys who just kind of like steamroll everyone on their way to the top. But you know what? Maybe it's not always about that cutthroat competition.
Yeah.
Like take Jacob Astor, right? This guy, he was all about building this massive fur empire across America back in the 1800s. But his story, it's more about working with others, taking big risks, and just rolling with the punches.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Astor wasn't just some fur hoarder. This guy, he had this vision, this commercial highway stretching all the way to the Pacific. It was a pretty strategic move, especially with the U.S. just starting to eye the West. And let me tell you, it wasn't a walk in the park. He had to figure out how to work with the Native American tribes, the real experts on that land. And then there were these European powers playing their own games. And of course, nature itself was always ready to throw a curveball.
To really dig into this time, we dove into a bunch of historical stuff, like Astoria by Washington. Irving Astor actually commissioned that one himself. We also looked at other records from back then. What we really wanted to do was go beyond the whole lone hero story. We wanted to see how people actually worked together back then, especially on these crazy, ambitious projects.
It's funny, even Astor's start in America was a bit of a surprise. He didn't just suddenly discover the fur trade on his own. It was actually another German guy on the boat over from Europe who tipped him off. This guy saw the potential in trading with Native Americans and how those London connections could be super valuable. Right off the bat, you see how important sharing knowledge was.
And it didn't stop there. Just a year and a half after landing, Astor married this woman, Sarah Todd, and she was like his secret weapon. From what we know, Astor really listened to her, especially when it came to judging furs. She had a knack for it. And that's not all. Her family was connected to these big-time Dutch traders in New York, giving Astor access to a whole network. She was the one pushing him to rub shoulders with the bigwigs at places like the Tontine Coffee House that was like Wall Street back then. It's so cool how Astor's drive wasn't just his own. Sarah's know-how and connections were essential. It makes you think even the most go-getter types often depend on the people around them. It's a good reminder for all of us to look around and see what talents we can tap into.
And you know what's really sharp about Astor? He knew how to use those early connections. He didn't just go to Montreal, that was like fur trade central back then, to buy furs. He went there to learn the ropes. He wanted to understand how those established companies, especially the Northwest Company, his main rival, were doing it. He even tagged along with their traders on a trip to Grand Portage on Lake Superior. That was their main hub, That trip gave him this insider's view of how the Canadian fur trade worked. They were the big dogs at the time. He saw how far they'd reached into the continent.
It was like he was doing a competitor analysis, but also building relationships while he was at it. All that groundwork paid off in 1808 when he met with President Jefferson. From what we read, they actually had a similar vision for the West Coast. Jefferson wanted a nation that spanned the continent, and Astor saw dollar signs, lots of them.
That meeting was like a green light. After talking to Jefferson, Astor came up with this whole strategy that matched his money-making goals with the president's big picture plans. So in 1809, he sends out the Enterprise that was his first move on the global trade scene. And then in 1810, boom, he launches two major expeditions. The Tonquin, that was going to sail around Cape Horn, and the Overland Party, they are going to cross the continent by land. With the president in his corner and all that fur trade knowledge from Montreal, Astor was ready to go big.
When those voyageurs, the guys hired for the Overland Party, got to New York, it was a sight to see. Imagine this. This massive 40-foot birch bark canoe just shows up on the Hudson River. It was paddled all the way from Montreal by 9 French-Canadian voyageurs. People were blown away by how fast these guys were and how skilled. It was like this symbol of the wilderness and the guts it took to explore it. It's one thing to read about it in a book, but imagine seeing this thing for yourself, a 40-foot canoe in New York. It really brings home how massive and ambitious this whole thing was.
That canoe is the perfect picture of how big Astor was thinking and how bold he was. But let's be real, it was a dangerous game, and the Tonquin's voyage was proof. On board, you had these important guys, partners like Duncan McDougall, David Stewart, Robert Stewart. All of them had tons of experience in the Canadian fur trade.
But right from the get-go, there were problems, especially between Captain Jonathan Thorne, the guy in charge of the ship, and the Scottish partners. Thorne was a bit of a stick in the mud, very suspicious. Even when they needed fresh water at the Falkland Islands, he almost didn't let them get it. Was that typical for ship captains back then, or was Thorne just
extra uptight. It's like a sign of the trouble ahead, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. And the Falklands were rough. It really shows you what they were up against at sea. Later on, when they were sailing past Cape Verde, this heavily armed ship starts tailing them. Nobody knew who it was, but with all the tension between countries at the time, it was probably British. Must have made everyone on edge.
But the real challenge was getting to the mouth of the Columbia River in March 1811. That place, the Columbia Bar, it was notorious. The river current slams into the ocean waves, and it's chaos.
In trying to cross it, well, it was a disaster. They lost a longboat, the one carrying Alexander Mackay and David Stewart, among others. It was just swallowed up by those crazy waves. That was a brutal welcome to the Northwest, a real wake-up call.
It was a terrible loss, but the Tonquin did manage to get through the bar in the end, though it got stuck and banged up pretty bad. Talk about a rough start. It shows you the insane risks these guys took just to get where they were going. But even with the overland party struggling, the Tonquin getting there meant Astor's Pacific dream was starting to take shape.
Meanwhile, the overland party was facing its own set of problems. Wilson Price Hunt, the leader of the expedition, was busy recruiting in Canada and St. Louis. Finding experienced voyagers wasn't easy, but Hunt and his partner, Donald Mackenzie, they had a trick up their sleeve. They used the fancy, colorful clothes that voyagers were known for to lure guys in.
I love that image of these tough guys in their flashy outfits. It's like a perfect blend of Native American practicality and European style. But even with their cool clothes, the trip up the Missouri River was rough, and it started in October 1810. Winter hit early, and they couldn't get to their planned stop near the Mandan villages. They ended up stuck at the Nodaway River in present-day Missouri when the river froze over. It's like a lesson for any big project.
Yeah.
You got to be able to adjust, have a plan B when things go wrong.
Being stuck for the winter didn't help the mood. People started getting nervous about the journey ahead, especially with all the stories going around about Blackfeet attacks on other fur trading groups. When spring finally came, Hunt went back to recruiting, and he even bumped into the legendary Daniel Boone near La Charrette. It's like this symbol of how American ambition was pushing westward.
It's amazing, right? The old frontiersmen meeting the guys leading the new wave westward. Then, not long after that, Hunt's group met these three Kentuckian trappers, Robinson, Reznor, and Hoback. These guys had given up on their own trapping because of the Blackfeet. They had seen how dangerous they were, and they warned Hunt.
They told Hunt straight up, get horses from the Arikara villages and go by land. It's the only way to avoid the Blackfeet. So Hunt had to go talk to other big names in the fur trade, guys like Manuel Lisa and Pierre Dorion, to get horses and interpreters. He had to make deals and give gifts to the Arikara chiefs, including Lagos, to make sure they'd be safe and have the right transportation.
And so instead of sticking to the river, they got horses. With the Shoshone as their guides, they headed west, crossing the Bighorn Mountains. That just shows you how important Native American knowledge was. These early expeditions totally depended on their expertise.
But get this, even with the horses, the rough terrain forced them to build canoes. They thought going down the Mad River, which we now call Henry's Fork of the Snake River, would be faster. But the trees there, spruce and cottonwood, they weren't good for making strong canoes.
And that trip down the Mad River was dangerous. Those cottonwood canoes were heavy and hard to steer, especially loaded with supplies. And the rapids, forget about it. They ran into some Shoshone folks along the way, but everyone was nervous, so getting good info about the river was tough.
And then came Cauldron Lynn. That was a total mess. They were trying to carry their stuff overland, and they lost canoes and a bunch of trade goods. They finally realized that river was way more dangerous than they thought. It was a huge setback. They were getting desperate, low on food, and they had to turn back.
Things were going downhill fast. The guys were exhausted and starving. Hunt's group got separated from Crooks's group, making things even worse. It was a test of how much they could take.
In all that chaos, Marie Dorion, man, she was something else. Pregnant through most of the trip, she just kept going. She even had her baby at a Shoshone camp. When you compare her toughness to some of the other stories, it's pretty amazing. If you're into those kinds of human stories in history, you should check out Mindful Moments. It's this AI audiobook analysis YouTube channel that really digs into the emotions and lessons in these stories.
Yeah, Marie Dorion was incredible. But things didn't get easier. Crossing the Blue Mountains in Oregon during the winter with snow up to their knees and almost no food left, that was pure torture. It was a race against time to save the guys who were falling behind. They were completely worn out when they finally made it to the Sayatoga village on the Columbia River. But there were these rumors going around about other groups having already gone downriver, which wasn't exactly comforting.
Making it to the Columbia was a huge win, and not long after, in March 1811, the Tonquin finally showed up at the mouth of the river. The Astorians picked a good spot and started building their trading post, Astoria. They even began working on a small schooner, the Dolly, to help with trade along the river.
It felt like things were looking up, but then tragedy struck. In June 1811, Captain Thorne, along with Alexander Mackay and some others, sailed north along the coast. They were hoping to get sea otter furs from the tribes up there, the really valuable ones.
And that's where things went south. They ran into the Clayoquot Indians at Vancouver Island, and it was a clash of cultures and economics. They couldn't agree on the price of the furs, and Captain Thorne, well, he looked down on the natives. He didn't respect them. It's a sad reminder that these ventures weren't just about business plans. People died because of arrogance and not understanding each other's ways.
The Clayoquot warriors launched a surprise attack, killing almost everyone on board. A few sailors managed to climb up into the rigging and survive for a while, but then the Tonquin blew up. It seems like one of the wounded sailors, defiant to the end, set off the gunpowder magazine.
The loss of the Tonquin was a huge blow. Back at Astoria, McDougall and the others were completely isolated and terrified. They realized just how vulnerable they were. Then there were these strange rumors coming from a native fishing camp nearby, and that didn't help their nerves.
But then, in January 1812, a little bit of good news. Donald Mackenzie and his small group showed up out of nowhere. They brought the first news about the Overland Party, though it wasn't good news. A month later, Wilson Price Hunt and the rest of the Overland Party finally stumbled into Astoria. They were in bad shape. You could tell they had been through hell. One of the guys, Archibald Pelton, had gone crazy from what he'd seen and experienced. It was a reminder of the mental toll this journey took on them.
Even with all that, they still had the Northwest Company breathing down their necks. They were serious competition. David Thompson, one of their top explorers, went to the Columbia River and claimed it for Britain. He even showed up at Astoria after the Astorians had already set up shop.
And then in June 1812, war broke out between the U.S. and Britain. Talk about bad timing. Astor tried to protect his business on the West Coast, sending instructions to the captain of his ship, the Beaver. But the winter of 1812-1813 was tough at Astoria. They weren't sure what was going to happen, and they were running out of supplies.
In the end, with the British Navy on their doorstep and supplies dwindling, Duncan McDougall made a tough call. He sold Astoria to the Northwest Company in 1813. Astor was crushed when he found out, even though Hunt eventually made it back.
Selling Astoria was a big loss, but it still played a part after the war. The Oregon Country was shared by Britain and the U.S., and the fact that the Americans had been at Astoria first was a big part of their claim to the area later on.
And what happened to all the guys involved? What's interesting, Robert Stewart ended up doing well for himself, working for Astor's American Fur Company. Alfred Seton had some more adventures and eventually got rich. Joseph Miller went back east. The Dorian family stayed in the West. And John Day, the guy who went through so much, his name lives on in some of the geographical features out there. They even think they might have found the Tonquin's anchor in Clayoquot Sound, a real piece of the past. And Robert Stewart's journey back overland was a nightmare. They were so desperate they even talked about cannibalism. That's how brutal it was for those early explorers.
So you see, John Jacob Astor's story isn't just about one man's ambition. Yeah, he wanted to be rich and powerful, but it's more complicated than that. It's about people working together, overcoming crazy challenges, and dealing with the unexpected. Even the biggest dreamers rely on others, and they can't control everything that happens around them.
That brings up an interesting question for all of you listening. When you're going after something big, do you really think about all the things that could go wrong? People, the environment, all those unpredictable factors that can change everything.
That's a good question to think about. If you liked learning about the wild early days of the American West and the people who lived through it, hit that subscribe button and tell your friends about this. And if you want to go even deeper, we put a link in the description where you can buy Astoria by Peter Stark. Keep questioning the stories we're told about progress, and remember all the struggles and victories that shape history, the stuff we don't always hear about.